Breaking news, relationships are really hard. They require an investment of time, energy, and emotion, and it's easy to often think that they're simply not worth the hassle. But before you break up the relationship, consider breaking up with some bad beliefs. Relationship strategist coach Tre Bradley is here to tell us more. Welcome. How are you, my friend?
I'm great.
Welcome back to GMT.
Absolutely. Great to be back.
Well, okay. Now, this may seem like a silly question, but I think it's an important question. Why is it that relationships are so difficult?
Well, I think ultimately it comes down to how we are having a relationship with ourselves and some of our beliefs about relationship and about love. And that collides at a certain point, especially once all the, what I call the dopamine wears off.
The whole, you're talking about like the whole love,
all the crush and everything from the beginning, once that wears off.
Fuzzy feeling.
Exactly. Now you're in the full-blown relationship.
Okay, so let's talk about, because you say that some of the problems that we may be experiencing, it's easy to say, well, it's because of the relationship, it's because of the other person, but it really might be more with these kinds of conditioned beliefs that we have and we hold on to. Can you explain that a little bit more in detail?
Yeah, so with every relationship, you're coming out of the relationship first and foremost from your childhood and the relationship you have with yourself. And so some of these beliefs get stored in the back of your mind. And what I found in most of the relationships or couples that I'm working with is when they get to the point where they're ready to like call it quits, the first thing we start to look at is that, well, let's really dive into what are some of the beliefs you're having or feeling as it relates to your partner, and where does that belief originate from? All
right, we're going to do like a little role play here.
Oh yeah. Okay.
All right, so I'm going to talk about one of these kind of these beliefs that can be kind of toxic, and then we're going to address that. Okay, so here it is. If they really loved me, they'd know what I need, and I shouldn't have to keep explaining it. What do you think about that?
So, wouldn't it be great if all of our relationships, we could read each other's mind? Because this is an issue where we would love to have someone read our mind, but ultimately, if you haven't given them the exact specific things that you need or explained it in a way where they can understand, then to assume that they're gonna know exactly what you need is really a fallacy. So what we try to do is make sure that have you fully articulated exactly what your needs are?
Have you really stated it?
Have you really stated it?
Right.
And so imagine like someone, let's say anniversary comes up and your expectations of your partners that they were gonna plan something.
Right.
Right? And then come to find out they didn't plan it, or they didn't plan the things that you thought they were gonna plan. So then that creates a conflict where you believe that they
should know you well enough.
They should know you well enough to know exactly
what to do. But
exactly.
the reality is they can't be mind readers.
Absolutely.
All right, well, let's talk about another one. All right, next belief is they're not communicating. That must mean that they don't want me anymore. Is that a common thing that you hear in your practice?
That's a common thing. And what that comes down to is you're perceiving silence as rejection. And it may not always be the case. Sometimes silence is just a page break. Right? You know how when you open a book?
I thought you meant like a page break. No. Like, so just you need a break from page. You're talking about an actual page in a book.
Yeah, absolutely, right.
Okay.
So, you know, sometimes it could be, for example, it could be someone who they're overwhelmed. There might be a lot more things going on in their mind or in their emotions that they're not able to express and articulate. So silence doesn't always equal rejection. So just be mindful that, you know, to really express what is it that you are feeling or getting from their silence, or even ask instead of assume. I always say if you're going to make up something anyway, why not make up some of the best things that it could be?
All right. So here's another one. This is the third one. If they really loved me, they'd stop doing the things that hurt me. And that's a common one too.
That's a very common one.
Because we do have these assumptions that in these relationships that they should understand, especially if there's been enough time given to the relationship. If you've been in a relationship for 20 years, I can understand why people would say, if they really loved me, they would know, they'd stop doing these consistent things that hurt me. But you say that in and of itself can still be a toxic belief.
Absolutely. Because in a situation where you have things that have just been happening and the person hasn't communicated in a way that they understand, or they have their own internal blueprint about how they think things should be. And that comes to a point where now what you value and what they value are totally different, but it doesn't mean that they don't love you or that they wouldn't necessarily do whatever it takes to make things work.
All right, so let's talk about another one. All right, so here's another core belief. This is, I'm gonna turn to the camera here and say, all right, we keep having the same arguments over and over. That must mean that we're just not meant for each other. And that, I think, is another common thing, that if you continue to do this cycle a time and time and again and continue to have the same arguments, something is wrong. But once again, you say it's important that we hold up the mirror and turn the focus inward instead of constantly blaming the other.
So this whole process is simply check in with the relationship you have with yourself. So having the same argument doesn't necessarily, what it is that every relationship goes through cycles, right? So let's say, for instance, it's the argument is cycle around money, right? Or a certain time or season of the year. So these arguments seem to come up. Who's going to go over whose house for the holidays, right? But the problem is sometimes this hasn't fully been flushed out or named in a way till you can identify, like, what's the real issue here? What's really going on? Why do we keep having this same type of upset over and over and over again? Well, let's find out where is it really rooted in. And so that's combing through and peeling those layers back. You kind of get to the real source, and then you find out, like, wow, we were actually on the same page, but we're not communicating it.
And the whole thing boils down to communication. You also talk about something called love anchors. That's a big pivotal part when it comes to the healing. Okay, so we have these beliefs, but how do we work through them? How do we get past them in order to resolve the relationship?
Yes, so the love anchors models, what that helps with, it creates a new frame, right? Because we're coming from all different types of cultures, beliefs, family backgrounds. So what I found is that the consistency is that to anchor love into your relationship, understanding that the way men are biologically, just how we're programmed instinctively, and the way women are instinctively, men need three things: food, sex, respect. I say they're literal and symbolic.
Food, sex, respect. That's what men need.
Literal and symbolic. And then women, it breaks down to security, protection, attention, affection, and appreciation. And for the men, those three anchors are independent. And for the women, those five are interdependent. So each one is connected and feeds into the other one. And what I've done with that, it really helps to kind of step back a little bit and see, all right, so what are my needs and why am I feeling like this relationship can't work or why it's over? Well, once we break down, like, okay, what has to happen for you to feel more secure? What has to happen for you to feel more respected? And everybody has their own unique way of feeling that. But you got to almost step back a little bit so you can reevaluate what's really missing and is it still possible? And what I like to say is that at the end of the day, it doesn't mean that your relationship has to still continue. There might be a case where it is incompatible.
It is incompatible.
But if you can go through the process, you can make a decision versus a reaction.
All right, so speaking of the process, if we want to get more relationship advice from you, where should we come?
Go to www.learnlovetogroww.com.
Learnlovetogroww.com. I'd like for you to come back and talk about these anchors. I think that's a really important topic, and I'd like to explore that some more.
Absolutely.
All right.
Love to.
Thank you so much for
You're
being
welcome.
here.